Welcome to the deep dive. Today, well, we're not just drinking a Coke today. We're going to uncover the fascinating history of Coca-Cola's business strategy, how they built their empire. But first, a word from today's sponsor. It's Cloutfit.ai. That's Cloutfit.ai. They're a B2B fashion commerce platform using AI, and they boost user engagement and help their clients see some serious revenue growth. And, speaking of mastering engagement, that's exactly what we're going to be dissecting today with Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
We've got a stack of sources for this one. And they reveal some surprising twists and turns about how this company built a global empire.
Yeah, for sure.
So think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding Coca-Cola capitalism.
Okay.
And stick around because you might realize that it's way more relevant to you today than you think.
That's a great point. Coca-Cola capitalism is a term coined by the author of our main source to describe this unique approach to business. And it's not just about Coke. It's a model that so many companies have followed. The core idea is minimizing ownership of the production and distribution, and instead they focus on building a powerful brand and leveraging strategic partnerships.
So instead of owning every step of the process, you're more like the conductor of an orchestra. You're coordinating, you're leading, but you're not playing every instrument?
Exactly. You got it. And it makes you think about today's tech giants, right? How they rely on app stores for distribution, and then they manufacture their devices in other countries. Are they using a similar playbook?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
That's one of the things we're going to look at in this deep dive.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock all the way back to 1886 Atlanta. Our sources introduce us to John Pemberton. He was a pharmacist who created Coca-Cola, but Pemberton didn't have the money to build a huge company from scratch.
Right. He had a great product, but limited resources. So what did he do? He partnered with soda fountain operators. And this was brilliant for a couple of reasons. First, the soda fountains were already serving customers who were familiar with patent medicines, which was a market ripe for Coke.
So he's tapping into an existing infrastructure and a target audience.
Yeah. And second, this wasn't just distribution. This was targeted marketing before the days of social media. Coke even had these traveling salesmen called drummers who would spread the word and get soda fountain operators on board. By 1899, with just 15 salesmen, Coca-Cola had a presence throughout the South.
Wow, that's really impressive, especially back then. Now I'm curious about how bottling came into the picture. That seems like a pretty crucial part of Coke's success.
Yeah, bottling didn't happen until 1899, and it was a turning point, but it was also a bit of a gamble. The agreements they signed with bottlers were incredibly favorable to the bottlers, which led to massive growth but also future tensions.
So a decision that was both a blessing and a curse. But wait, there's more to the story, right? Our sources also reveal something kind of surprising about Coke's reliance on public infrastructure.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. Coke actually relied heavily on publicly funded water systems for its bottling plant. Think about the cost savings. This saved them millions in infrastructure costs.
Wow, yeah. It's almost like a hidden partnership, right? And our source material mentioned it wasn't just water. Many businesses at the time benefited from public investment in things like railroads and electricity.
Exactly. It makes you think about the hidden costs that we as consumers pay for through taxes to support businesses. It makes you wonder what other industries today rely on similar models.
Okay, now let's get into the ingredients themselves. Obviously, sugar's a big one for Coca-Cola, and I imagine securing a steady supply wasn't always easy.
You're right. Coke's dependence on external sugar suppliers made them very vulnerable to price fluctuations. The source material even mentions a dramatic sugar crisis in 1920. Prices just skyrocketed and then plummeted, leaving companies scrambling.
Wow, so what did Coke do? Did they try to gain more control over sugar production like some other companies did?
Interestingly, no. Our sources contrast Coke's approach with that of Milton Hershey, who tried to control sugar production in Cuba, but he ultimately failed. It really highlights the different approaches companies take when managing risk in their supply chain. Do you control everything, or do you rely on partnerships?
That's a great question, and one I'm sure a lot of businesses grapple with. Now on to caffeine. I was so surprised to learn about Coca-Cola's original source for this key ingredient.
Yeah, it's not common knowledge, is it?
No.
Initially, they got their caffeine from the waste products of tea and cocoa production.
Wow.
Resourceful, right?
Definitely. But this seemingly insignificant detail actually played a role in a much larger story.
Oh, you're exactly right. This ties into the pure food movement of the early 20th century. Coke was able to argue that its caffeine was natural because it came from these other sources, not an additive. This became a very clever marketing tactic as people became more aware of what was in their food.
So a savvy way to position themselves in a changing market. But there were some legal battles around caffeine, weren't there?
There was a fascinating trial in 1911 in Chattanooga. Coke was accused of being contaminated by a black cook. The case highlights some of the racial anxieties of the time, and Coke cleverly avoided addressing the actual health concerns around caffeine.
Wow. It's a reminder that social and political dynamics can impact business in very unexpected ways.
It certainly is. And on that note, we also have the intriguing story of Maywood Chemical. Coke's caffeine supplier, they benefited from a legal loophole that allowed them to sell decotainized coca leaf extract exclusively to Coca-Cola.
Wait, cocaine? That's an unexpected twist. So they had a virtual monopoly on this ingredient thanks to a quirk in the legal system.
Exactly. And that brings us to World War II, a pivotal moment in Coca-Cola's global expansion.
World War II, a global conflict that must have presented both challenges and opportunities. I'm eager to learn how Coke navigated this turbulent period.
Well, one thing they did brilliantly was secure contracts to supply troops overseas. This positioned Coke as essential for morale. They even had marketing campaigns that emphasized the importance of the rest pause, framing Coke as a revitalizing necessity for soldiers.
That's brilliant marketing, turning a beverage into a morale booster. But wasn't there also a connection between Coke's expansion and the Marshall Plan?
You're right, the Marshall Plan was aimed at rebuilding Europe after the war, and it indirectly helped Coke gain a foothold in new markets. However, when they tried to get the ECA to directly fund bottling plants, they were denied. Coke was considered a luxury, not a necessity.
Oh, a small setback in their global ambitions. Speaking of seemingly contradictory moves, our next topic is Coca-Cola's foray into bottled water, which seems a bit ironic, considering their core product is a sugary drink.
It might seem counterintuitive, but there is a strategic logic at play. Think about the growing demand for bottled water. Even when tap water is available, Coke was able to capitalize on this trend, positioning bottled water as a convenient and safe alternative.
And they also made efforts to provide bottled water during local water crises, right? Building a more positive image.
Exactly. But it does raise questions. Is bottled water a necessity or a luxury? What about the environmental impact?
Yeah, it's a topic that sparks debate, and we'll dive deeper into it later. But for now, let's move on to another complex issue, the obesity debate and the role of sugary drinks.
Yeah, this is a sensitive topic, and it's important to approach it with nuance. There's growing concern about the link between sugary drinks and obesity, and Coca-Cola has found itself right at the center of this debate.
It's interesting that our source material highlights the irony of the high fructose corn syrup label. It's often portrayed as significantly different from sugar, but the difference in fructose content is actually quite small.
You're right, and it just goes to show how certain terms can be used to sway public perception. So how did Coca-Cola respond to these growing concerns? Well, they adopted a multi-pronged approach, introducing diet drinks, low-sugar options, and even bottled water.
A pretty big departure from their original sugar-laden formula.
You could say that they've also poured a lot of money into marketing campaigns that emphasize personal choice and moderation.
So a way of acknowledging consumer concerns while also defending their core business. This debate is far from over, though, right?
Absolutely. Coca-Cola, like many food and beverage companies, is operating in a world where health concerns are increasingly influencing consumer behavior.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study in how businesses must constantly evolve to stay relevant. So what are some of the key takeaways from our Coca-Cola deep dive so far?
Well, we've seen how a single product can become deeply entangled with global economics, politics, environmental issues, and even personal health choices. Coca-Cola's story reminds us that business decisions have ripple effects that extend far beyond the boardroom.
It's a story that continues to unfold, and it makes you wonder, what's the next chapter for Coca-Cola? What new challenges will they face, and how will they adapt?
Those are great questions. What stands out to you from this deep dive? What are your thoughts on Coca-Cola's legacy?
For me, it's a reminder that business isn't just about profits and growth. It's about understanding this complex world we live in and making responsible choices that benefit both the company and society as a whole.
Well said. And if this exploration of Coca-Cola has sparked your curiosity about the intersection of business technology and culture, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more insightful discussions.
And don't forget to check out our sponsor, Cloutfit.ai. That's CLOUTFIT.ai. They're using AI to revolutionize fashion commerce and help their clients thrive in a competitive market.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We're picking up our exploration of Coca-Cola's journey. And in this part, we're going to see how their famous bottling strategy evolved over time. You'll be surprised at some of the factors that shaped these decisions.
Yeah, that's right. Remember those early bottling agreements we talked about? They gave bottlers a lot of autonomy, which fueled that rapid growth, but also created some headaches for Coca-Cola as they tried to maintain control over quality and pricing.
Right, it sounds like a classic growing pain for a company. finding that balance between expansion and consistency.
Exactly, and that tension really came to a head in the 1920s. When Robert Woodruff took over the company, he believed in streamlining operations and maximizing efficiency. In fact, one of his famous quote was, "If you can get somebody to do something better, then you can do it yourself. It's always a good idea."
Hmm. Sounds like a champion of outsourcing and delegation. But I imagine he still wanted to make sure that Coca-Cola taste remained consistent across the board.
Absolutely. Woodruff understood that consistent quality was key to brand loyalty. And believe it or not, this focus on taste led to a rather unexpected concern: water quality.
Water quality, I wouldn't have immediately connected that to the taste of Coke.
Yeah, it makes sense when you think about it. Bottlers were sourcing their water locally, and variations in water could actually affect the final taste of the beverage.
Ah, so a subtle but crucial factor that most people probably wouldn't even think about.
Right. Woodruff became very concerned about making sure that the bottles used water that wouldn't compromise the Coca-Cola taste. This even ties into the rise of chlorination in public water systems in the late 1920s.
Oh, interesting. Chlorination is meant to purify water, so did that create problems for Coca-Cola?
Well, there were some worries that chlorination might affect the taste. However, Coca-Cola's lead chemist at the time, Dr. William Pratt Heath, actually argued that any water safe for public consumption should be fine for Coke.
So a vote of confidence for public water treatment, it highlights how even a global company like Coke was still dependent on these local factors.
Precisely. Now let's shift gears back to caffeine. We talked about how Coke initially got its caffeine from waste products, but as demand for Coke skyrocketed, that approach obviously wasn't going to cut it.
Right? They needed a more reliable and scalable source.
Exactly, and that's where they partnered with companies like Maywood Chemical, which specialized in extracting caffeine from various sources. But here's where we encounter a rather intriguing legal twist. Maywood Chemical, besides supplying caffeine to Coca-Cola, also produced cocaine for medicinal purposes.
Cocaine. Wow, that's an unexpected connection.
Right, and to complicate matters, the Harrison Act of 1914 had placed restrictions on cocaine production, but there was this legal loophole, sometimes called the Coca-Cola Joker, that exempted decocainized coca leaf extract.
So a loophole that essentially benefited Coca-Cola.
Yes, this loophole allowed Maywood Chemical to sell their decocainized extract only to Coca-Cola.
So it sounds like they had a very unique advantage in the market thanks to this legal situation. It really shows how business and law can be intertwined in some complex ways.
It absolutely does. Now, as we move into the mid-20th century, we see Coca-Cola becoming a truly global brand. World War II, as we mentioned earlier, played a big role in that expansion.
Right? Supplying troops overseas gave them a foothold in all these new markets. But did they encounter any pushback or challenges as they expanded globally?
Of course. Expanding into new territories often means navigating different cultural norms, political climates, and economic realities. For example, our sources mention Coca-Cola's experience in India.
Oh, what happened in India?
Well, India, with its vast population and diverse culture, presented some unique challenges. For one thing, there were concerns about water usage. Remember how Coke relied on public water systems? Well, in some parts of India, water scarcity was already a very serious issue.
So their business needs clashed with local resource constraints.
Exactly. It led to protests and accusations that Coca-Cola was exacerbating water shortages in certain communities.
Yeah, that brings up the whole issue of corporate social responsibility and whether a company's global ambitions align with the needs of local communities.
You're hitting on a key point there. This wasn't just an issue in India either. As Coca-Cola expanded globally, they faced similar concerns about water usage in other parts of the world, especially in arid regions.
So this tension between their global goals and the local consequences of their operations seems to be a recurring theme.
It definitely is, and it underscores the increasing importance of sustainable practices and considering the environmental impact of business operations.
Yeah, it makes me think that companies can't just focus on profit and growth anymore. They really have to think about their impact on the world around them.
You're absolutely right. Now, as we've seen throughout this deep dive, Coca-Cola's history has its share of both innovation and controversy. They've been incredibly successful at building a global brand, but they've also faced a lot of criticism.
Yeah, it's a complex legacy, and it really prompts us to think critically about the role of these massive corporations and the impact they have on our lives. But there's more to uncover. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll jump into the final part of our Coca-Cola deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the final stretch of our exploration into Coca-Cola's journey, and things are about to get really interesting as we look at some of their more recent challenges and adaptations.
Yeah, you're right. We've seen how Coke navigated wars and legal loopholes and global expansion, but some of their biggest hurdles actually came from changing consumer preferences and societal trends.
Makes sense, tastes evolve, and companies have to adapt or risk getting left behind. So what kind of curveballs did Coke face in the later part of the 20th century?
Well, one development that seemed to contradict their core business was the acquisition of Minute Maid in 1960.
Minute Maid, the orange juice company. That seems like an odd choice for a company known for sugary sodas.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it was actually a very strategic move. First, it allowed Coca-Cola to diversify their product portfolio and appeal to the growing health-conscious market.
So a way to hedge their bets and offer something for everyone.
Exactly. But here's the surprising part. The acquisition came with an unexpected bonus. Minute Maid owned a coffee company called Tenko that decaffeinated its coffee beans, which meant Coca-Cola suddenly had a built-in source of caffeine for their sodas.
Wow, talk about a two-for-one deal. Did they stick with this vertical integration and keep producing coffee and orange juice long term?
Interestingly, no, they eventually divested from both Tenko and their coffee brands. It seems they realized that managing those agricultural operations wasn't really their strength.
So a strategic retreat back to their core competency of branding and distribution. Sometimes knowing what not to do is just as important as knowing what to do.
Couldn't agree more. Now, another major shift Coca-Cola had to grapple with was the rising environmental consciousness of the late 20th century.
Right, people were becoming more aware of waste and pollution, especially when it came to packaging. I imagine the iconic Coca-Cola glass bottle started facing some competition.
Absolutely. Aluminum cans and later plastic bottles became increasingly popular, but this shift to disposable packaging created a whole new set of challenges for Coca-Cola.
Our sources mentioned a growing backlash against litter, with Coca-Cola becoming a target of criticism. Those images of discarded Coke cans and bottles definitely don't align with their image of happiness and refreshment.
You're right, it was a PR nightmare. Initially, Coke responded with anti-litter campaigns, urging consumers to dispose of their containers properly.
I remember seeing those "please dispose of properly" messages printed on bottles and cans.
But those campaigns could only do so much. The real issue was the sheer volume of disposable packaging being produced.
It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon.
A very apt analogy. And that's where the recycling movement gained traction. It seemed like a logical solution, but it wasn't without its complexities.
Setting up an effective recycling system requires a lot of infrastructure and coordination and technology. I imagine there were also some economic factors at play.
You're right, it was a big undertaking, and Coca-Cola, along with other beverage companies, initially opposed bottle bills, which placed a deposit on containers to encourage returns.
Makes sense. They probably saw those bottle bills as a logistical headache and an added cost.
Exactly. Instead, they heavily promoted recycling as a more viable solution.
But as we've seen throughout Coke's history, they're pretty adaptable. Did they eventually embrace recycling?
They did eventually. They invested in recycling infrastructure and incorporated it into their marketing campaigns.
So a shift from resistance to acceptance of this new environmental paradigm. It sounds like they realized that being environmentally conscious wasn't just good for the planet, but also good for business.
Exactly. And finally, we can't wrap up this deep dive without addressing one of the most significant challenges Coca-Cola has faced in recent decades: the growing scrutiny of sugary drinks and their link to health problems.
It's a topic we touched on earlier. This is where Coke's legacy gets intertwined with those larger societal concerns about obesity and diabetes and the role of corporations in shaping our food choices.
It's a complex issue, and Coca-Cola has responded by diversifying their offerings with diet drinks and low-sugar options and even bottled water.
A pretty big departure from their original sugar-laden formula.
You could say that. They've also poured a lot of money into marketing campaigns that emphasize personal choice and moderation.
So a way of acknowledging consumer concerns while also defending their core business. But this debate is far from overripe.
Absolutely, Coca-Cola, like many food and beverage companies, is operating in a world where health concerns are increasingly influencing consumer behavior.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study in how businesses must constantly evolve to stay relevant. So what are some of the key takeaways from our Coca-Cola deep dive?
Well, we've seen how a single product can become deeply entangled with global economics and politics and environmental issues and even personal health choices. Coca-Cola's story reminds us that business decisions have ripple effects that extend far beyond the boardroom.
It's a story that continues to unfold, and it makes you wonder, what's the next chapter for Coca-Cola? What new challenges will they face, and how will they adapt?
Those are great questions. What stands out to you from this deep dive? What are your thoughts on Coca-Cola's legacy?
For me, it's a reminder that business isn't just about profits and growth. It's about understanding this complex world we live in and making responsible choices that benefit both the company and society. And that's it for this deep dive into the fascinating world of Coca-Cola capitalism. If you found this deep dive useful, share it with someone who'd love smarter fashion tech. And don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.